Hello. The Warhammer world is home to many weird and whimsical forces of fantasy, but there's perhaps no more wonderfully wild than the Wood Elves, an ancient people who sought refuge in the magical forest at the heart of the old world, becoming protectors and allies of the trees that lived within it. But the development of the Wood Elves was far from quick. They took their time, delving into many different inspirations and facets of real-world history. Designers and artists would draw on Celtic and Native American iconography, and writers would explore classic fantasy fiction, folklore, myths, and legends. And altogether, it would create a unique fantasy race for the Warhammer world. Both in the game's world and on the tabletop, the Wood Elves have had an outsized impact for such a small faction. But where did they come from? What inspirations truly drove the creation of this faction as we know them? And how did they come to be what they are today? I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're building Warhammer Armies, Wood Elves. The Wood Elves are as old a Warhammer faction as you can get. There is a stat line for them in the first edition of the game, and a Citadel miniatures range that predates it entirely. But they have been written in a curious way, because unlike many of the other factions in Warhammer, they were consigned to a tiny pocket of the Warhammer world, which they had an innate displeasure at leaving, giving fewer and fewer explanations as to why they were in fights all around the setting. Of course, there is an incredible history to the Wood Elves, and we will get into all of that. But before we do, why don't we just talk about exactly what a Wood Elf in the Warhammer world is most commonly thought of as. Warhammer's Wood Elves are an intensely secretive people. Living deep in the magical realm of Atholloran, at the heart of a great Bretonnian forest, they have developed a deep bond with the forest itself. Their rulers are aspects of the gods, and they are dedicated to the natural world, taking a dim view on those creatures that would trespass into the woodlands and seek to exploit its bounty. Allied with the tree men, dryads, and spites of the forest, the great eagles above the treetops, and unicorns and steeds of the glade, the Wood Elves are patient hunters, experts with bow and spear, war dancing into battle with the righteous fury of the earth itself. They are the guardians of the forest, and they will protect it with fierce prejudice. This is Building Warhammer Armies, my regular series where I look at the origins and evolutions of the greatest factions in the history of Warhammer. There are already episodes available about Skaven, the Empire, Orcs and Goblins, and many, many more, including some about 40k factions too. All of those are available in a playlist here on the channel, so don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more, and there will be more to come in the future. There is also an episode about the High Elves, which, given we're talking about the Wood Elves and there is a lot of shared history, I would highly recommend taking a look at once you're done with this one. Don't worry, there is an overlap in the origins of these two factions, but they do diverge quite significantly, and one of them is covered in mud and bugs, and that's the one we're talking about today, Warhammer's Wood Elves. So let's take our first sylvan steps along the knotty history of the Wood Elves by taking a look at how they were written about in the very first edition of the game. Written by Brian Ansell, Richard Halliwell and Rick Priestley, this is taken from Volume 1, Tabletop Battles. Elves are humanoid creatures of lofty aspect and handsome appearance, who prefer to live in the proximity of trees. All elves are expert woodsmen and can move through woods at normal speed. Elves are often unaffected by fear and terror, where other creatures quail and run. Elves hate goblins, orcs, and night elves. Night elves are evil, perverted elves and do not cause fear. They hate other elves. Alongside that brief description, there are 4 elvish stat lines: Night, Sea, High, and Wood Elves. But they would be expanded upon very quickly with the release of 1983's first supplement for Warhammer, Forces of Fantasy. Wood Elves live in woodlands and forests, as their name suggests. They are expert woodsmen and archers, and their armed forces reflect this preference for the bow. Wood Elves are the most practical and least sophisticated of all the elf races, preferring hunting, dancing, and singing to arduous study and learned discourse. Orcs and goblins are the main enemies of the Wood Elves, and many a long battle has taught the goblins to fear elven valour. Sadly, elves are not over fond of dwarves either, and the history of the two races is not an entirely peaceful one. All Wood Elves belong to one of the tribal troops whose main peacetime duties involve patrolling the borderlands and intercepting unwanted travellers, itinerant merchants, and beggars. In war, these same troops form the regiments that make up Wood Elf armies. Wood Elves are great bowmen and usually fight delaying actions until they can pick off the most threatening or least stable enemy troops. Once engaged in combat, the horsemen take up positions on the flanks of the infantry or behind to fend off attackers. Wood Elves favour bright natural colours, although they have no such things as uniforms in the strict sense. Clothing is often green, grey or natural browns, such as yellow ochre or tawny. It's fair to say that in the first edition of Warhammer and Forces of Fantasy, there wasn't really a setting for the game. You were expected to create your own or draw on inspiration from many other settings that you already enjoyed. There was no need for there to be a dedicated Warhammer world, because you could bring whatever you wanted to the tabletop. However, there were some seeds that were drifting on the breeze, and it wouldn't take long for them to take root. One of those was the distinctions between those elvish factions, something which would draw on a number of different sources, but which would quickly become a core part of Warhammer's identity. The Book of Battalions was another sort of supplement that came out around 83 or 84. It was given away free with copies of the game or with copies of Forces of Fantasy. Really, it was just a pamphlet that presented some example armies that had been created by various members of the Citadel staff and the people that they played with. These were mostly just for fun, but they do give a bit of an impression of how different factions were already being considered at this early stage in Warhammer's history. Particularly fun is that the intro to the Book of Battalions made clear that none of the contributors could be guaranteed as really existing, with the exception of Brian Ansell, who was said to be 100% real and consequently dangerous. Richard Halliwell, meanwhile, was apparently 0% real, whilst Rick Priestley was 25% likely to exist, and John Blanche was right on the borderline at 50-50. In the supplement itself, there are 11 example army lists, each composed of 3 battalions. Amongst the unusually colourful armies are those such as the Slan Army, the Clawed Feet of Milk Bottle, an undead army that's always fun to remember, the Conjurations of the insane necromancer Colin, and a Nipponese army that might be better worth forgetting, the Tale of Sanyo Kawasaki. For our elvish friends, there was a single great army, the Grand Elf Alliance. This was an army of predominantly Sea Elves and Wood Elves, but there are some High Elves present too. The Sea Elves continue to represent the hard-working coastal elves who manned the fleets and sailed the seas of the Warhammer world. I've actually compiled a full research article about the history of Sea Elves over on my Patreon if you're interested. But sadly, the Sea Elves wouldn't last too long in the setting despite their prominence here. Meanwhile, the Wood Elves present in this list hail from Nottingham Forest. They hunt with hounds and are proficient with bow and spear. And though they are committed to their sylvan haunt, they can be persuaded to cross the natural border of the River Trentwin to join the Grand Alliance of Elves if the price is right. There was already the sense of the Warhammer world as a place for fun, for puns, for silly, adventurous nonsense. But there was also clearly an inspiration being drawn from the real world and from various different bits of fantasy literature. And there was one particularly important inspiration that would only continue to offer new ideas and to drive the way the Warhammer world would develop. Okay, so I don't know if you know this, but the Lord of the Rings is really, really big. And the Middle-earth is very complicated, and there is a lot of lore, a lot of story, a lot of background information. I really don't know an awful lot about it, but it is so influential, so important to the creation of Warhammer, because this is one of the things that was being drawn on, looked at, and inspiration was being taken from in the creation of the different factions in this early stage of Warhammer's life. So we are going to have to take a moment to talk about Lord of the Rings and D&D, because it is only because of Lord of the Rings that D&D and Warhammer have set up their elves in the way that they have. The elves of Tolkien's Middle-earth are an ancient, nearly immortal people. They are composed and graceful, practiced archers, and they live in and amongst the natural world, often in the woods and forests of Middle-earth. Inspired by Old English poetry, Icelandic folktales, and many other myths and legends, Tolkien established different kindreds of elves in his world, including some communities that would become known as the Wood Elves. In Latin, the word silver means wood, whilst Sylvanus was a woodland deity. From this etymological root, the French word sylvan sprouted, which came to be sylvan in mid-16th century English. Both were words for describing something of the woods. In Tolkien's work, the Sylvan elves are often reclusive, forest-dwelling elves. These wood elves primarily inhabit the woodland realms of Lothlorien, later Lorien, and the Mirkwood. By the end of the Third Age, they would become isolationist and disconnected from their kin, whether by choice or by circumstance. Thanks to the word Sylvan, and perhaps because of Tolkien's woodland-dwelling Sylvan elves, it's probably no surprise that the eventual successors to the Wood Elves of Warhammer would be called the Sylvaneth in the Age of Sigmar. Much could be said about Tolkien's elves and their wider influence on the creators of Warhammer, and there are clearly a great many elements of the Middle-earth that made their way directly into the setting that was being built by Citadel. Of particular note for us are the very nature of the Sylvan elves, and their relationship to the natural world. The Ents of the Fangorn Forest are an ancient tree-like people, who would play a role in shaping the lumbering allies of the Wood Elves. Even the name of the great old world forest, Athel Loren, owes a debt to Middle-earth's Lorien, and, even more tangibly, the Citadel range had included several models specifically based on Tolkien's work. Amongst them was the ME31 series of Sylvan Elves of Mirkwood. And then, of course, there are the D&D elves. In Dungeons & Dragons, there are also Wood Elves that are distinct from different kindreds. And because Citadel had a license to produce D&D miniatures, they were in the Citadel range too. Wood Elf, sometimes called Sylvan Elves. These creatures are very reclusive and generally avoid all contact. Wood Elves are more neutral than any other elves. They live in primeval forests and distant woodlands. Wood Elves speak only Elvish and the languages of certain woods animals and treants. Their complexions are fair, their hair is yellow to coppery red, and their eyes are light brown, light green, or hazel. They wear russets, reds, brown, and tans. Their cloaks are usually green or greenish-brown. Wood Elves have a lifespan of centuries. Citadel would produce a number of Ralpartha miniatures that had been sculpted by Tom Mayer around this point in time, which had originally been developed for use with D&D. That range included High Elves, Sea Elves, and Wood Elves, and it is literally for that reason that all three types of elves were included in the first edition of Warhammer. Then, as the Citadel range continued to grow and was sculpted in-house for use with the first edition of the game, it would also include its own range of elves, C09, and that featured some dedicated sculpts specifically to represent Wood Elves. As the Citadel range continued to expand, the various Good Elf codes were merged together into a single range, designed to represent High, Sea, and Wood Elves all together however you fancied. And then, of course, eventually, things would become more distinct once again, but that would take a couple more years. The characterization of Wood Elves as isolationist, protectionist, and self-involved isn't as relevant to the early Warhammer world as it would be to the later one. In that first iteration of Warhammer, it couldn't be further from the truth. These were elves who were engaged and active in the wider world. The informal Book of Battalions army, the Grand Alliance of Elves, features a Wood Elf battalion who are just as happy to be involved as the Sea Elves and the High Elves. The regiments of renown would see Wood Elves fighting for any army across the old world. Hold on, I just need to pause for a second to talk about this episode's sponsor. Now, unfortunately, no companies seem to want to sponsor me, so instead of a formal sponsorship, I'm going to take a moment to talk about my Patreon instead. It is only because of my Patreon supporters that I am able to continue doing this work, researching and documenting the history of Warhammer and Games Workshop. I absolutely love delving into the secret stories behind these games that we adore and speaking to the people who were responsible for making them. Over on my other channel, Jordan Sorcery Pods, you can see interviews with the likes of Rick Priestley, Jervis Johnson, John Blanche, and many, many more of the incredibly talented people who are actually responsible for creating Warhammer and 40k and building Games Workshop into the thing it has become today. Now, as you know, or probably know, YouTube is a very fickle and unusual place to spend a bit of time, and it is really hard to get these videos in front of the people who might enjoy them. I think that this is valuable work, and I'm very, very grateful that my Patreon supporters think so too. So if you would like to help me, you can share this video, you can comment on it, you can like it, you can tell your friends about it, and if you really want to support me, you can take a look at the Patreon via the link in the description below. There is exclusive and early access content, there are research articles, there's updates on the things that I'm working on, and hopefully there's a lot of fun stuff in that community that you might enjoy. And of course, it is absolutely essential to helping me to continue to do this. So thank you very much to my existing patrons, and thank you if you want to check it out, because I am really very appreciative for all of the support that you're able to offer. Okay, enough of that, let's get back to the Wood Elves. Even though it was released only a year after the first edition, the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy would do a lot of work to establish the setting, the known world, in a way that we would recognise today. There would be a lot more detail about the Wood Elves, and although there was already the start of a bit of friction about whether or not these elves were set apart from their high elf cousins and more actively engaged in the community of the old world, or whether, like the rest of the elves, they were isolationist, haughty, and didn't want to be part of anything. 5,000 years before present, departure of the elves from the old world. Only a few isolated communities are left deep within the forests. They are destined to become the Wood Elves of the old world. The bestiary entry further expands on the nature of these Wood Elves. The Wood Elves represent the last vestiges of the colonies founded long ago in the Old and New Worlds. The people themselves are more broad-minded and less self-preoccupied than High Elves, even going as far as to maintain relations with humans. They are excellent bowmen, although reluctant warriors. Their numbers are few and declining. Wood Elves love hunting, singing, dancing, and jocular merrymaking. Those Wood Elves that return to the Elven Kingdoms find themselves dubbed boorish or rural. There are a few very small communities in the forests along the eastern edges of the World's Edge Mountains, and several larger colonies on the eastern coasts of the New World. Much as with Tolkien's multi-generational world building, the idea that the Wood Elves of the old world were the remnants of High Elf colonies became a foundational aspect of the faction's lore from this point on. There's also the nominatively determined truth that they live in the forests and woods of the Warhammer world. There is an aspect of the Wood Elf lore that is dropped after this edition for most of the game's life, only being resurrected in the 8th and final edition of the game, and that is the idea that the Wood Elves exist in most wooded and forested areas of the known world. There's talk here about the New World having colonies of elves, presumably Nagaroth and Lustria having Wood Elf communities. That is something that will be completely removed in later editions. The Wood Elves become very concentrated in just one place. There's also an interesting idea in the nature of the Wood Elves population. They were already a small subset of the elves, the ones that wouldn't leave the old world and wanted to stay. So they are a small population to start with, and like all elves, they are declining in number. There are fewer and fewer left. That means that there are hardly any Wood Elves in the old world. And yet, there is also an interesting aspect that we will see in many different games throughout Games Workshop's history that would see Wood Elves as the elf that joins adventuring parties and goes on quests. It is typically Wood Elves that one finds in the adventuring parties of early quest games like Hero, Advanced Hero, and Warhammer. In the pages of 1986's Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, you'd find the most common type of playable elf to be a Wood Elf. But over the courses of editions, sightings of the Wood Elves beyond the borders of their forest homes would become far less common in the tabletop battle game. Similarly, their relationship with humans would evolve from being an adventurous compatriot to something altogether more magical and even at times quite sinister. In these earlier editions of the game, there were just more Wood Elves out and about across the Warhammer world, fighting more battles, and when they did, they shared the same methods of war as their kin. The Ravening Hordes book for the second edition presented an elf army list that could be used to make armies of High Elves, Sea Elves, and Wood Elves. A lot of the unit choices overlapped, with scouts, chariots, and animal handlers all being available across the different elf types. There were even High Elf war dancers in this edition. That said, you were expected to see a higher proportion of huntsmen and falconers in a Wood Elf army compared to the armies of the Elven kingdoms. The Wood Elves did receive some distinct unit options as well, and they all received the Woodcraft Special Rule, which meant that they could move through forested terrain unrestricted, gain better cover from wooded ground, and make ranged guerrilla attacks for free from the safety of the woods. They could also lay traps on the battlefield during the course of the game, creating pits and spikes for unwary enemies who may accidentally fall in during their movement. In the Allied section, we would see rules for including treemen in an army. There had been treemen in the bestiary of the first edition of Warhammer, and they would appear pretty consistently throughout editions of the game. During this second edition, there was even a treeman called Clinty in one of the first scenario packs released for Warhammer, The Tragedy of Macbeth. The earliest treeman in the Citadel range had been released back in 1982 as part of Citadel's Fiend Factory range for use with Dungeons and Dragons. In 1985, Nick Bibby sculpted a model of Treebeard for the Lord of the Rings miniature range, which would later be reworked by Michael Perry to become a Blood Bowl treeman. And then in 1992, Trish Carden would produce an iconic treeman for the Marauder range. There would be many more classic treemen from Trish over the years, including the special character Durthu. It's probably also worth noting here the work of artist Arthur Rackham, if for no other reason than he drew some pretty cool tree guys. Working at the turn of the century to illustrate many fairy tale and fantasy books, Rackham has been hugely influential and has been cited by the likes of Trish Carden and John Blanche as a huge influence on some of their work. Looking back through some of Rackham's pieces, it's easy to see how the Wood Elves may have taken some inspiration from the fantastic style and ethereal nature of his art. In the early years of Citadel's Warhammer range, the elf models were designed to be used by any elf faction. Whether you were fighting for High Elves or Wood Elves or Sea Elves, you could use the same models, and that meant that there was a mix and match approach, shared models that didn't really look like one thing or the other, but in time, they would become far more distinct. For the Wood Elves, that would see the introduction of some shamanistic magic users, some glamorous war dancers, and some hooded archers, and that was led by two iconic units, regiments of renown. The first were the Bowmen of Orion, and the second were Scarlock's Wood Elf Archers. Released in 1984 as the 7th Regiment of Renown, the story of Prince Orion is a somewhat quirky one. His regiment fights not with the Wood Elves, but rather with the Sea Elves. All of the remnant Wood Elves of the Old World are noted for their amazing skills with the bow. From amongst his father's people, Prince Orion chose the best archers and woodsmen and assembled this famous elven band. With his company, Orion left the Old World and took ship to the Elf Kingdoms, where he joined the crusading army of the Sea Elf Lord Stalior. He fought with distinction in Stalior's Southlands campaign, losing an eye in hand-to-hand combat with the evil wizard Dornbast. After losing that eye, the elf prince became sullen and introspective and eventually vanished to who knows where in the Warhammer world. This turn of events in the story would be quite fitting though, because Orion as a character would not remain a significant part of Wood Elf lore, eventually fading from view completely. This was probably quite lucky given the similarity of his name to the later King in the Woods, who would become central to the faction's story. The initial miniatures for Orion's bowmen are the quintessential Wood Elf archers, wearing vibrant green cloaks and carrying powerful bows. Curiously, the 1984 minis are mostly composed of swordsmen, rather than those readying their bows. With the move from solid metal bases to slotters for the Citadel range over the following year, the regiment was re-sculpted by Ali Morrison, and they are much closer to the classic bow-wielding troopers we would be seeing a great deal more of as the Wood Elf faction evolved. By 1987, Orion would be a thing of the past, and a new company of Wood Elf archers would take over the mantle of the Regiments of Renown. This time, they would be led by a champion known as the Hooded One, but his real name was Scarlock. Named for the character Scathlock in Paul Anderson's influential 1954 fantasy novel The Broken Sword, like Orion, Scarlock is the one-eyed archer leading an elvish regiment of renown, but his is composed not just of bowmen, he's also got a war dancer and a mage. Scarlock's eyes grew hard beneath his hood, and he raised one hand. Araflane Warskald lifted his great bronze horn to his lips, and its harsh bellowing note echoed around the clearing. The figure of an elf, with his body garishly painted and a great mane of impossibly red hair, ran towards the orcs, whooping and laughing in ferocious joy. The orcs were transfixed by the strange apparition, which charged towards them unscathed through a hail of arrows. He dodged and twisted past their blades, and whirled along the entire length of the front rank, leaving a trail of cut throats and locked arms in his wake, before leaping over the 3 ranks of orcs with another flamboyant somersault, which landed him atop the woodpile, with the orc leader's severed head in one hand. As the war dancer brandished the head, the rest of the elves broke cover, Scarlock with his bow on his back, brandishing his great rune sword, Araflane with his horn bellowing over the confusion, Kaya Stormwitch with the group's standard held high, and lightning crackling from the blue-silver blade of Herathim, and elves all around charging into the clearing with swords drawn. Released in 1987 and sculpted by Jez Goodwin, Scarlock's regiment are a sight to see. They have the lean appendages of classic Goodwin elf art, and the unhooded amongst them rock magnificent manes of flowing hair. In the 1980s, UK punk hairstyles were still in fashion at this time, and Goodwin clearly took note. In time, Scarlock's name would be spelled slightly differently, replacing the Paul Anderson adjacent kicking K with a far more graceful C, but the character would remain available to players in the 4th edition of the Wood Elf Armies book. Later versions of the game would eschew stats for this legendary archer, but his deeds were enshrined in the timeline of the Wood Elves. Even the 8th edition book would refer to the hero several times, including his slaying of an incarnation of the evil beastman Morgur, and his time as a sellsword of renown travelling the old world. Scarlock's regimental standard bearer was a magician called Kaya Stormwatch, and she already has the look and feel of the spell weavers and spell singers that the Wood Elves would employ in later editions. But perhaps more iconic is Scarlock's champion. Called Glam the Laughing Warrior, he was a war dancer. War dancers are the closest elf equivalent to berserkers. They are skillful, energetic, acrobatic fighters who regard combat as an art. War dancers are unique amongst berserker types, in that they have a degree of self-control, and also because they often fight from horseback. Jez Goodwin sculpted a range of war dancers that set the lasting tone for these wild warriors, drawing on Celtic imagery with elements of glam, punk and post-punk fashion. The war dancers are lean and dynamic, and would be an early indicator of the future visual approach for the Wood Elves. The same year, Goodwin would also produce the only regiment of renown for 40k, and they clearly share some of the same conceptual origins as the war dancers. They were the Eldar Harlequins. Warhammer's Battle of the Bouffant Bonces was building brilliantly. Around this time, White Dwarf also shared some other images of the expanded elf range. These warriors and personalities were still designed to cover not just the Wood Elf army. It was a continuation of the shared elven army list building that had been present since the beginning of the game. The mounted elven personalities feature some models that do lean further towards one kindred or another, often through the volume of armour that they wear. But they technically could all represent elves from any origin. The Elven Warriors range also contains multitudes. There are clearly some elves that are the prototypes for High Elf warriors, and others that might make sense in a later Wood Elf force. Goodwin, having sculpted some of the Eternal Champion range based on the Michael Moorcock Elric books, also brings some of that Melnibonean energy into this range, and together with Ali Morrison, they created an Elf Warrior range that is full of adventurous style and interesting visuals. The wider Elf miniature range would continue to expand over the course of the 80s, with one major addition being the introduction of a plastic box set in 1987 called the Warhammer Fantasy Regiments. The 10-sprue set included 60 miniatures, each sprue offering an orc, a dwarf, a skaven, a dark elf, a goblin, and an elf. The elf was not described specifically as a wood elf until a later reissue of the set as fantasy fighters, but the Jez Goodwin sculpt clearly follows the design approach that was developing for the faction. Many Wood Elf miniatures would be produced by Marauder Miniatures, the separate company set up by Brian Ansell with Ali Morrison and Trish Carden, specifically to create more Warhammer Fantasy miniatures. Marauder and Citadel sculptor Trish Carden has shared online many images of the original greens for the early Marauder Wood Elf range, noting that in the designs there were several nods to Native American culture and fashion, such as the fringed buckskins and the feathered hairstyles. In the midst of this growth, there would be a major change to the world of Warhammer, a product that was released that would redefine much of the character and feel of the Warhammer world, and redefine its setting for a brand new age. In 1987, the 3rd edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle was released. The descendants of those Wood Elves left in the Old World following the wars against the dwarfs are still there, but have not had much contact with either humans or dwarfs. The Wood Elves of the Old World live amongst the deep woodlands, notably Laurelorn Forest in the Empire and the Lorraine Forest in Bretonnia. They are few in number and intensely secretive. Few humans have ever seen a Wood Elf, and almost none have ever entered one of their settlements. The 3rd edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles incorporated much of the world building that had taken place in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay's 1st edition, but because that game was so focused on the Old World and the Empire in particular, it did not actually have a great deal of detail about the Wood Elves. The Fantasy Battle 3rd edition would be an inflection point though for the nature of Warhammer's Wood Elves. Whilst they had once been described as more open and merry than their High Elf cousins, they now became even more isolated and rare than the High Elves. They lived amongst the other nations of the Old World, but they were not really part of it, eternally hidden in the depths of the forest and content to leave the younger races to their own affairs. It was here that we would also get more detail about the elves of Athel Loren, the great forest in which the elves were primarily living. The largest Wood Elf realm is that of Athel Loren, situated deep within the Loren Forest. Like all Wood Elf communities, Athel Loren lies under a concealing enchantment, making it impossible to find, and causing explorers to lose their way and bypass the place. Unlike other communities, Athel Loren is a large settlement, and its king and queen are traditionally held to have lordship over all Wood Elves in the Old World. The Warhammer Armies supplement for 3rd edition provided the foundational army lists that would underpin most of the main Warhammer forces for the rest of the game's history, and the Wood Elves were no different. Their list includes mounted lords on chariots, Wood Rider cavalry, Glade Runner scouts, the elite Lord's bowmen, and regular units of archers, beastmasters, and warrior kinbands. Some entries in the list, like Shapechangers and Falconers, would become less relevant or incorporated into other units in later editions, but Treemen and War Dancers, now just one word, would be mainstays for every edition to come. White Dwarf issue 96 had included preview rules for this new version of the War Dancers, written by Matt Connell and Graham Davis. That section would go on to be republished in the special rules of the Warhammer Armies book. This was where they first introduced the restriction that High Elves could no longer be War Dancers. The Sea Elves still had that honour with the Wood Elves, but only for now. In 1991, White Dwarf issue 141 would showcase the work of legendary heavy metal painter Mike McVeigh. He had just completed work on his first ever complete Warhammer army, and you will never guess which faction he chose. I decided on Wood Elves in the end, purely from a visual point of view. I really like the strong Celtic feel of the miniatures, and I wanted to expand this with a few ideas of my own. The traditional look of green clothing for the Wood Elves has never really appealed to me. I am sure there are far more interesting things that can be done with them. The Wood Elf miniatures already have a very strong Celtic feel to them, and as I have always been inspired by American Indians, I decided to combine the two looks and see what I came up with. McVeigh's beautiful army hammered home a visual identity for the Wood Elves and would become hugely influential for many years, especially when it came to the War Dancers. There were also several incredible conversions in the army that showed just what could be achieved with skill and patience. There would be an update to McVeigh's army a few issues later, with the addition of some Elven lords. And in that same White Dwarf issue, number 144, there would also be updated rules for the War Dancers written by Andy Chambers. The article suggests that elves are one of the most popular armies in the game at that time, and that there had been many questions about the War Dancer rules previously published in White Dwarf. Perhaps an early indication of how iconic and important the War Dancers had already become. It's also worth another mention of the Marauder miniatures range, because this was around the time that Trish Carden's new Tree Men would be released, and they truly are amazing. In my opinion, they are as fantastic today as they were the very day they were released. 1992's 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles changed everything. Okay, not literally everything, but it did change an awful lot. And that's because all of the fluff and lore that had been peppered through all of those different products over the last decade or so was gathered up together. It was chopped, it was sanded, it was whittled into a very sharp stick. And with that came a new description in the Battle Bestiary of the Wood Elves. The elves remain in the Forest of Lorren to this day. Over the centuries, their way of life has adapted to living amongst the forests. They are expert archers and woodsmen, able to move swiftly and silently through the greenwood. Lorren is their domain, a green and magical realm protected by elven sorcery and soldiery. This update included some new dimensions for the Wood Elves of Warhammer. No longer were they scattered through the many woods and forests of the known world. Instead, it was now suggested that they lived exclusively within the borders of the Lorren Forest in Bretonnia. And whilst the bestiary goes on to explain that the Wood Elves are physically identical to the High Elves, it also seems to suggest more of the ethereal fae-like qualities that the faction would later become closely associated with. The loose alliance, though sometimes fraught friendship with the Bretonians, is put front and centre in this edition, as is the magical danger of the forest itself. The idea that unwary travellers might get endlessly lost, whilst unwelcome guests might meet fates even worse, is heavily seeded in this text. The armies of the Wood Elves are still said to be made up of expert archers and young wild war dancers. The Beastmasters and Shapechangers have been merged into a single idea, with these unusual warriors briefly taking on the form of their adopted creatures in the heat of battle. This is quite unnerving for the enemy, who is confronted by a monstrous vision of twisting flesh and cracking bones, of claws that sprout from hand, slash, and are gone, leaving gaping wounds and gushing blood. This hint of body horror is something that will later become a more central feature of the Wood Elves, and especially their successors, the Sylvaneth. Their dark relationship with natural magic begins to do peculiar and gruesome things to the bodies of its adherents. Of course, the real introduction of the 4th edition Wood Elves wouldn't come for another few years. In 1996, Nigel Stillman would write Warhammer Armies, Wood Elves. Stillman was involved in a lot of Warhammer development through the 3rd to 6th editions, with credits on books like the original Warhammer Armies supplement. It would be Stillman who later wrote the 5th edition Armies book for the Bretonians, consolidating the shift in their background from a corrupt and decadent nation in the mould of pre-revolutionary France to a noble kingdom steeped in Arthurian legend. That new Bretonnia would be a key element of the new Wood Elves lore as well, with background for the two factions entangled like the root systems of Lorren Forest. The Wood Elf realm of Athel Loren lies hidden in the midst of the vast forest of Lorren, in Bretonnia. This mysterious woodland realm is all that remains of the elven colonies that once existed in the old world. Wood Elves have acquired an instinctive cunning and stealth, and have developed a healthy suspicion of strangers and a distrust of anything unnatural. They shun contact with other races, and show no mercy to those who invade their realm with malicious intent, or those who do damage through sheer ignorance or foolishness. They have become the guardians of the forest. As with the core book, the Wood Elves are said to live almost exclusively in the Lorren Forest, with only the briefest mention of some lost kin that might have survived elsewhere in the old world. The welcoming merrymakers are well and truly gone, and instead the Wood Elves and their forest allies are distrusting of others, isolated in their own realm, and have become eco-warriors seemingly above the cares of the wider known world, as long as things don't affect them or their forest directly. Cover art for the book was by David Gallagher, and it absolutely captures those aspects of Celtic and Native American influences that were increasingly at play during this era. Internal black and white art was by John Blanche, Wayne England, Mark Gibbons, and Des Hanley, and there are some magnificent examples within. I must stop and point out another Dave Gallagher piece from the book, The War Dancer, that would also grace the cover of the Warhammer Quest character box for the same name. It's just brilliant. I believe it was Wayne England who drew many of the Green Man icons in the book. Also known as a foliate head because of the foliage surrounding the face, this kind of Green Man iconography has been seen since Iron Age Celtic artworks and is said to represent rebirth and the cycles of seasonal growth. The book briefly explores the relationship between the Wood Elves and the humans of Bretonnia, that loose alliance that has been built on Bretonian fear of the supernatural woods, and the elves' understanding that these humans will aid them against orcs, goblins, and foul beastmen should they need it. In line with the Arthurian tales of questing knights lost in the woods and succumbing to curses, tricks, and the whims of fairies, there are also stories here of Bretonian lords who took liberties in the forest, felling trees and building castles, only to be vanished by supernatural mists and the living woods. The danger of Atholoran is given as much prominence as the deadly warriors of the elves are. In fact, this aspect of the Wood Elves is truly heightened in this edition and will only be more heightened as each edition comes from here on out. They are still physically the same as their High Elf cousins, but their behaviours, the way in which they act, it has become increasingly inexplicable and alien. The forest spirits are still present, they're more present, and they will only become more present, but their influence on the elves that live with them is becoming increasingly pronounced as well. The dryads of Greek mythology, nymphs or spirits of the great oak trees, are introduced as a new unit type. The miniatures were sculpted, of course, by Trish Carden, further bringing the forest to life and giving it an increasingly sinister feel as well. And of course, there are still plenty of those Trish Carden tree men swaying about. Glade riders and elven steeds, the Way Watchers who could still lay traps on the battlefield, and the war dancers were all present and correct. There was also the inclusion of unicorns, a creature that had been present in earlier Warhammer bestiaries, and which Mike McVeigh had wanted to convert for his Wood Elf mage. Perhaps the most impressive addition to the army in this edition, though, was the Forest Dragon, an incredible model. The beast sculpted by Carden, and the rider sculpted by Gary Morley. Morley was actually involved in updating many of the Wood Elf sculpts for this range, including the new war dancers and mounted characters. Ali Morrison also worked extensively to bring the range up to date. As the 4th edition was famous for introducing special characters, the new Wood Elf Armies book wouldn't have been complete without them. And whilst there are 10 in total, including our old friend Scarlock, there are 2 that stand taller than the rest: the Mage Queen of Lauren and the King in the Woods. Ariel is the Mage Queen of Lauren, an incredibly powerful magic user who has acquired aspects of the elf goddess Aisha. Possibly named for the spirit from Shakespeare's The Tempest, Ariel, like her husband, is linked to the changing of the seasons, dying each midwinter, only to be reborn the following year in the Oak of Ages. The King in the Woods is Orion, an elf who has been blessed with aspects of the hunter god Kurnos. Both Orion and Ariel wandered from their kin in the early days of the Wood Elf settlement of Atholoran, and they were taken by the spirits of the forest to become vessels for the power of their mighty elf deities. It seems possible that Orion was given his name because of the first Wood Elf character Orion, but it could also be a nod to the classic story by Lord Dunsany, the king of Elfland's daughter. In that story, the ruler of a human kingdom called Earl dispatches his son to Elfland to secure the hand of the Elf King's daughter in marriage. Prince Alvaric succeeds in his quest, marrying Lyrazel, before various tragedies befall them. The novel features a border that separates the magical elf realm that cannot be passed easily by mortals, as well as a plethora of runes, spells, and enchantments. Published in 1924, it is said to have been one of the most influential works of fantasy literature. It's an influence that almost certainly made its way to Warhammer at some point over the years. And in particular, in the story, the child of Alvaric and Lyrazel is called Orion. Dunsany wasn't the only external influence on the creation of the Wood Elves to this point, though. And although we know that Jez Goodwin had drawn on Celtic mythology and iconography when he was crafting the elf range earlier on in Citadel's history, it would be with this edition that Nigel Stillman would draw very much more on Celtic and Gaelic folklore in his conception of the Wood Elves, particularly on the stories of the Sidhe. The Sidhe are a race of supernatural beings often described as elf-like in nature. They are the fairy folk of the burial mounds, which themselves are portals to another world of everlasting beauty, joy, and abundance, a parallel world to our own. In Irish folk traditions, the Sidhe are fiercely protective of their homes, often being associated with great whitethorn trees, and their neighbours must tread carefully to avoid angering the fair folk and suffering their righteous vengeance. There are many aspects and permutations of these folktales. The Banshee, for example, and the idea of fae stealing babies and replacing them with changelings are both derived from this same source. These influences would find their way into Paul Anderson's The Broken Sword, from which we got the name Scarlock, and from there they also made their way into Michael Moorcock's work, whose Elric stories played a large role in the creation of the High Elves and the Sea Elves. Not all of the elements of these stories would be incorporated into Warhammer's Wood Elves, of course, but the idea of the Sidhe as these guardians of the forest, these protectors of nature who would wreak unholy vengeance on anybody who trespasses across their borders and defiles nature, well, that is an idea that Warhammer could really get into bed with. If you are going to cross the Wood Elves, seriously, if you're going to leave your campsite a mess, if you're going to litter in the forest, the Wood Elves of Warhammer are going to have a real problem with you. And in later editions, you're going to feel really bad about it. Now, this video has already lasted a great many seasons and midwinter approaches, so I can't spend as much time looking at the later editions of the game as I would like. The story of how the Wood Elves continue to get closer to this conception of the Sidhe, continue to become more supernatural, these neither good nor bad forces of nature, it's something at the heart of the later editions of the game. And because I don't want to just leave the story here, we're going to take a moment just to take a look at some of the most significant evolutions in those later editions. I just wish I had more time. The next Warhammer Armies Wood Elves book was released in the 6th edition, written by Anthony Reynolds and Matthew Ward. The cover for the book was by Paul Dainton, and it already sets the tone for the army. The elves wear wilder and more verdant armour. They are supported by fearsome, almost tyrannid-like tree beasts, and the entangled and defeated beastmen in the foreground speak to the dark mercilessness of the Wood Elves of this era. The entire game in the 6th edition took on a new grimdark aspect, and that would permeate through the Wood Elves just as it would with other armies. The ever-present threat of the foul beastmen would be emphasised, and they would become a natural opposite to the Wood Elves, their ability to taint and corrupt the forests becoming an existential anxiety. There are more stories of mercurial forest spirits, and the Wood Elves are said to kidnap local human children to be eternally youthful slaves in service of new elven masters. Capricious and unpredictable, the Wood Elves have been likened to a force of nature, neither truly good nor evil. Athel Loren and the Wood Elves are far removed from simple comparison with the values held by other races. Like a placid lake, the Wood Elves can appear serene, beautiful and enchanting, or as frightening and destructive as a storm. For every intruder that the Wood Elves guide out of Athel Loren, another is slain without question or remorse, and left where he falls to be claimed by the forest. In this edition, the Wood Elves rose beyond the role of just protectors of nature, to becoming a part of it, unconcerned with moral ideas of right and wrong, merely with their own alien perception of the world. In keeping with this increasingly inhuman, or I guess in-elvish attitude, there would be another addition to the forest forces, the Treekin. These will-o'-the-wisps can form together dead branches and fallen trees to form magical constructs with which to fight in defence of the forest. The Dryads, meanwhile, became even more detached from anything even remotely recognisable. In 4th edition, they were still forest spirits, but they only became spiteful and vengeful if offended. In this edition, they were always spiteful and always deadly, with hearts akin to shards of ice. In both cases, the classic folk fantasy tale that they could turn into beautiful maidens to lure the unwary deep into the forest was a key part of their mythological armoury. There was also the addition of optional rules for armies called the Spites of Athel Loren, unpredictable nature spirits that could offer boons to the Wood Elf army. The personal bodyguard of the king in the woods were the Wild Riders of Kurnos, elite warriors who were no longer truly elves, having foregone their heritage to become part of the mystical wild hunt. In folklore, the Wild Hunt is a supernatural event led by great hunters like Odin. Anyone unfortunate enough to encounter it risks being sent to the underworld. This idea exists in folklore from many countries and regions, including a Welsh tale that in Arthurian legend saw a wild huntsman riding a demon horse, hunting and imprisoning souls at night with his pack of white-bodied and red-eared dogs of hell. The next Warhammer Armies Wood Elf book was the last, released for the game's 8th and final edition. Written by the Games Workshop Design Studio, rather than any specific credited author, it was released in 2014. Intriguingly, this book includes a thanks to Mythic Entertainment, the makers of Warhammer Online Age of Reckoning, and as far as I can tell, it's the only Armies book to do so. It's not entirely clear why this is though. In this edition, we would finally revisit the idea that the Wood Elves existed beyond the bounds of Athol Loren, with the introduction of the idea of the world routes that extended from the Oak of Ages into forests across the known world. This allowed the magical travel of Wood Elves to far-flung battlefields. Along with this change came more history, allowing Wood Elves to have organically been part of historical conflicts with many more foes in many more places at many more significant moments in the history of the wider Warhammer world. The armies of the Wood Elves would again gain more magnificent options, with an upgrade to the Wild Riders of Kurnos that would see them now not riding their elven steeds, but instead riding mighty stags. There was also the introduction of a unit of Ariel's handmaids. They were the opposite number to the Wild Riders, and would take to the battlefield as the Sisters of the Thorn. New miniatures for the Tree Men and Dryads would make them more spindly and even leaner, with the now common runic designs seemingly carved into their ancient and unknowable faces. These miniatures would become central to the later Age of Sigmar Sylvaneth, and it is clear to see how that trajectory would continue. The elves becoming less traditional, less elvish, and more enmeshed in the bodies of their supernaturally vicious tree creatures. The Wood Elves had been a part of the Warhammer world because there had always been Wood Elves in the Citadel range. They were a product of Tolkien, by way of D&D, and at first their distinctions from other elves were slight. Sure, they lived in the forests, but the only other thing that set them apart was that they actually wanted to be in the old world. They embraced it, and, strained dwarf relations aside, were open to friendly relations with the humans who lived there as well. Their designs increasingly embraced Celtic iconography, and their art made them into the quintessential woodland ranger. With the 4th edition of Warhammer, they had become something slightly different, a secluded group of isolationists who shunned the company of other mortals, and preferred to spend their time with the spirits and sprites of the forest. Visuals from Celtic soldiery gave way to Celtic mythology, and they became ever more a part of the forest that they protected, both natural and supernatural. These were no longer your grandpappy's elves. These became weird woodland weirdos with inexplicably weird whims and wildly weird ways. I think the Wood Elves are an interesting example of Warhammer's long-running development approach, where early factions were created by looking at all of these different sources of inspiration. Ideas were grabbed from all kinds of places and placed into the Warhammer world. And then over time, the things that really made them unique to the Warhammer world were found and discovered and revealed through lots of different writers' work, lots of different pieces of art, and lots of amazing miniatures. As things developed, there were certain factions that really honed in on specific details to make them incredibly Warhammery. And I think the Wood Elves are probably one of the strongest examples of that process. And you can see it across the course of Warhammer fantasy history and straight into Age of Sigmar history. I've often talked about how Age of Sigmar was almost like taking the Warhammer world and dialing it up to 11, or even more, to 12 or 1100 even, because it really found the specific design points, the key things that made something Warhammer, and then focused in even more. With the Wood Elves, we see that. We see the increasing body horror. We see the increasing use of the sprites and the dryads and the creatures of the forest, and the Wood Elves themselves have become a part of that. They've merged with the creatures of the forest. In the Sylvaneth, that is what you get. And it's a completely natural trajectory from where the Wood Elves were starting and evolving in Warhammer Fantasy's history. So This, I think, is one of those stories that is a compelling case study in how things have evolved and changed over the course of Warhammer's history. Now, of course, with the return of the Wood Elves in the old world, we are seeing a slight step back along the spectrum. We're not quite at the aliens of the 8th edition, but we're certainly not back at the friendly, jocular, merrymaking elves of the 2nd edition either. So we find ourselves somewhere, maybe 6th or 7th edition, that kind of feel of Wood Elves, I think. But I would love to know what you think of the current Wood Elves, what you think of the history of Wood Elves. What era is your favourite? There are plenty of different points in history where the Wood Elves have changed quite significantly. Leave a comment down below. Let me know. Let me know what other factions you want to see in the future. I'm already working on a Beasts of Chaos video, a Cathay video, and also I'm looking at some short Chaos guys for reasons. So there'll be plenty more episodes to come. But which factions would you love to see me tackle next? Let me know. I really appreciate your comments. If you can like and subscribe and share this video, that is enormously helpful as well. And of course, you can check out my Patreon via the link in the description below. And finally, if you are buying your own Wood Elves or any hobby supplies, you can use my Element Games affiliate link. That is linked down below. That will give you the cheapest prices available and also gives me a bit of money back for every purchase made. It really helps support the channel, and all of this stuff is greatly, greatly appreciated. So thank you so much for watching and supporting everything I do here. Thank you very, very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. Okay, I am certain that there is a joke where the punchline is Wood Elves, but I've not nailed it yet. I was thinking I wouldn't trust my life to a vengeful forest sprite. Wood Elves? Listen, I don't know what I'm doing.